So we left off talking about the Industrial Revolution and all the changes. We talked about Edison and all the other frauds of history that, not frauds, they weren't frauds. That's a little rough. Realistically, though, they were very much, they were borrowers of sense. And the way that they have been portrayed throughout American history is probably not the most accurate in all ways, correct? And so now we're going to talk about the other tycoons that kind of come up during this time frame. You had the inventors, and now you're going to talk about business tycoons. And this is going to be steel and oil and banking. And we're going to talk about some really, really powerful men behind these industries, okay? And so hence the title. Now, just as a concept, little bit behind the scenes, we've mostly, we've kind of celebrated the idea of transportation and electricity. However, steel is actually the driving force behind the Industrial Revolution, without a doubt. There's, really nothing more impactful than steel, because the way steel holds up more than iron or anything really is going to allow all of these new innovations to take place, and they're going to create lasting products and lasting things like railroads. And while railroads had been invented already and there was already steel kind of an invention, what really changes during this time is this guy right here, Henry Bessemer. And he invents something called the Bessemer process in 1856. And he doesn't invent steel, but what he does is he invents a way to actually produce it that makes sense and that is cost effective and time effective. Because when you, does anybody know how steel is made? So it's carbon, which usually comes And so he takes the profits from his first factory and buys another factory. And then he takes the profits from those two factories and buys two more factories. And then he buys two more factories. And then he buys two more factories. And then he buys two more factories. And he basically becomes the only person making steel in America. In fact, I believe at one point he was producing steel mills that Carnegie owned, produced about 85% of the world's steel. In a world that was quickly using steel at an alarming rate. He's making all of it. And, he kind of, by the 1870s, he begins to control all aspects of the steel manufacturing and he kind of coins what's known as a vertical monopoly or vertical integration, which is basically you're going to own everything from the very beginning of it to the finished product I'm going to sell. So not only am I going to own the steel mill, I'm going to own the coal mine and the iron mine. So when I have to buy iron, I just buy it from myself. So I don't lose profit. I'm also going to buy the railroad so that I can transport my iron to my steel factory. And then I'm going to buy the trucking company that's going to deliver the steel to the person that purchases it from me. So at no point do I lose profit. The only profit I lose is having to pay people to do all of it. And it's really smart way to do this. He becomes unbelievable. Carnegie, he wants to control the entire thing. Like I said, he's mining the ore, he's selling it, and he kind of sets up his empire in Pittsburgh at this time, which is kind of funny because that becomes like the steel capital of the world, and they end up naming a football team after that idea because now they are the Pittsburgh Steelers because they made steel there. And so he would buy up everything and then he'd move to the next region and buy everything and then move to the next region. And so he does this to agree, and he's also a very famous philanthropist. Basically, he ends up like donating like half of his entire life's wages to like philanthropy. He creates like Carnegie Hall, libraries. He builds thousands of libraries around the United States. He donates money for books and stuff, and he ends up being a huge philanthropist. And you're like, well, how much money did this guy really have? Well, if you take into account inflation, and so what his money would be worth today, Carnegie was probably worth at his peak around $310 billion. So to put that in perspective, that's like double what Elon has. It's about double what Elon has. Okay? $310 billion. And that dude was number 3 on the list of rich people of the time. Well, we're going to talk about it. But just to kind of put that in perspective, $310 billion, that's like, even if you said, oh, well, Elon, he's worth like $150 billion, that's like double. Jeff Bezos, the Amazon guy, at one point he was worth like $200 billion or something like that before he got divorced. And then he lost half of that. And then, but still like $200 billion, you're still talking about another $110 billion more. Like, what do you even do with that? He was like, I'll give it away, build libraries. And he did. In fact, it kind of became a competition of who could give away the most money, because it's incredible even to try and give away that much money. And then we talk about like the COVID money was like $1.3 trillion. And how do you even wrap your mind around that? That's 1,000 billions. Yeah, I know. Like that's like monopoly money. Like it doesn't even make sense when you think about how much money that is. And it's really kind of crazy. But he does get, quite a bit back, and so, yeah. Now, again, the Bessemer process and Carnegie Steel allow skyscrapers to revolutionize the building industry. Also, you start with the idea of like the Brooklyn Bridge is going to use this new steel, and you're able to build new expanses of bridges and get across rivers and get to places that you couldn't before, particularly with railroads. Yeah. And so this is all happening kind of in the late 1800s. Now, we're going to talk about banking real quick. This guy, John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, who he is a banker, he's a financer, and actually at one point in time in the 1890s, he actually, after Carnegie had already made enough money, in their time, he paid Carnegie like $500 million for his steel empire. Carnegie's like, I'm out of the game. Here, I'll sell all of this. It was called U.S. Steel. And J.P. Morgan just bought it. He has stacks like that. He's also very famous, J.P. Morgan, because he actually made a deal with the United States of America. The U.S. was going into a major depression in 1893. They didn't have enough money to kind of keep this depression from happening. Remember when COVID happened and our economy went into the tank, the U.S. is like, we'll pump money into it. Well, the U.S. government was in debt. And so they were like, well, we're going to default. This is going to be bad. We're going to basically, the whole economic system is going to crash. And J.P. Morgan came in and was like, don't worry, I got you. And he bailed out the United States of America with his checkbook. The dude bought the American debt. Like, yeah, pretty crazy. But he agreed. I mean, he just straight up at the time was like, I'll give you $65 million, America. Here's a check. It was crazy. What's our debt right now? Too much. So in our money, that was like several $100 million, even getting close to $1 billion. And he eventually merges his steel company with Carnegie's to form U.S. Steel. And at this point in his life, again, Carnegie's just ready to retire. He's given up, and he's taking the money and running. And J.P. Morgan is extremely, extremely wealthy. But both of those guys are nothing in comparison to this next guy, John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller was the oil baron. He basically invented the idea of being an oil baron. Now, believe it or not, when oil was first kind of used, they didn't know what it was good for until they started this process of learning that you can break it down into other chemicals. And one of those major chemicals that they're able to break it down into is called kerosene. Now, at the time, in the mid 1860s, late 1860s, late 1800s, there's no electric lights, right? And so everybody used kerosene lamps. Towns used kerosene lamps. The street lights were kerosene lamps. Everybody used kerosene, and that's made out of oil. And he essentially does with oil what Andrew Carnegie had done with steel. He uses the profits of one oil refinery to buy another one, then buy 2 more, then buy 4 more, then buy 8 more. And then he takes all that profit and he says, hey, I'm going to buy the, oil fields, and then I'm going to buy the kerosene company, and I'm going to buy the transportation company, and I'm going to buy all of this. And he was doing really good with kerosene until, the late 1800s, early 1900s with the invention of the automobile and the internal combustion engine. And that's when when it really took off, because to make kerosene, when you break oil down and you make kerosene, it creates a byproduct. One of the byproducts that it created was this very, very dangerous liquid that had no real use. It was too flammable to use in lamps because it had a tendency to explode. You couldn't use it in lamps. You couldn't use it to heat your home because it was too volatile. It burned up too fast. It wasn't like kerosene, which was like slow burning. It was fast burning, very explosive, very hot. And they were like, this stuff is dangerous. And so literally they just when they got it and it separated out in the factory, they would just set it on fire. For decades, they just set this stuff on fire because it was useless. And then the invention of the internal combustion engine found a new use for this chemical called gasoline. So they had just been getting rid of gasoline for decades, and then because there was no use for it, and then all of a sudden there's vehicles, and they run on gasoline, and this dude owns 80% of the oil production in the world. Not only does he own the oil production, he owns all the companies that sell it. And then he starts making roadside stations where people could refuel, and he owns them too. And his company was called Standard Oil. Okay? And he began to build these roadside way stations, places that people could stop and fill up, and he called them gas stations. He invented the idea of gas stations, basically, and then he owned every one of them. If anybody else from another oil company opened one up, he'd come in. Because he owned 80%, if they're selling gas for a nickel, he'd sell gas for a penny a gallon. And nobody would ever go to that other gas station until it cost them too much, and then they would shut down, and then he would buy it and then raise the prices to 10 cents a gallon because he's the only gas station in town. Because he had so much that he's like, I can afford to sell gas for a penny. You can't, but I can. And I'll do it until you're gone, and then I'll raise the price to whatever I want to because I'm the only gas station here. And so the dude was extremely brutal. He was extremely, it was incredible. So, again, he ends up 1863 in the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. He dominates production of oil from well to retail. And in 1882, he creates the Standard Oil Trust, and he starts selling certificates. Profits are shared, but all the oil production is controlled. He basically creates his own cartel, where he is the only thing in town. He also was like, wait a minute, I got to ship this oil. How do I ship this oil? And it'd be like, oh, you have to ship it in barrels. He was like, heck with that. I'm going to buy the barrel company too. I mean, he bought every aspect of what it would cost. He was like, how much does it cost to buy a barrel? And they're like, $2.10. And he's like, well, how much would it cost if I just made them myself? And they're like, $2 flat. I mean, just 10 cents a barrel. He's like, yeah, but I make 10 million barrels a year. So that's a lot. 10 cents, 10 million barrels, that's $1 million that I can save a year just making my own barrels. Okay, I'll do that. And I'll make them so cheap that I put everybody else out of business, and then I'll buy their barrel factories and then make more barrels myself. And then it'll be even cheaper because I can make more. So he says, well, what do I need to make barrels? You need lumber. Well, how much does it cost for lumber? Well, there's the cost. How much would it cost to cut my own trees down? So you want to buy a lumber company? Yeah. Well, you'll save about 5 cents a barrel in production costs. Great, let's do it. So he bought lumber companies. He bought sawmills. He bought iron to make the rings. He bought every aspect that you can imagine. He was like, I buy it, and that way it's cheaper. In the end, I make more profit on the whole. And yeah, he was very, very rich. This is called vertical and horizontal. Now, vertical is where you do everything that's in your field, right? Buy the mine, buy the shipping, buy the steel mill, buy everything, right? Horizontal is when you buy every kind of industry involved in your company. That's what Rockefeller did, and it was extremely, extremely effective. Rockefeller amasses an insane amount of money. He bankrupts anybody that was his competition, so he's the only game in town. If you were to look at it in today's value, there are some estimates that, because it's really hard to tell exactly how much money he had, because a lot of it was tied up in his industries and stuff. And eventually they come in and they say, hey, you're not allowed to do that. That's a monopoly. That's anti-capitalistic. And they actually make him break up his companies. So he takes Standard Oil and they make him break it up into a bunch of different smaller companies. But he gets to own 50% of all of the smaller companies. But he has to sell off a bunch of it. And he ends up making like a couple companies like Texaco, Chevron, Mobil, Exxon, all of these oil companies that are the big ones today, all were break-offs. So he actually ends up making more money after they break up his monopoly, because now he gets 50% of all of those companies, everything they do. And so he ends up making more money. By the end of it all, they estimate that he was somewhere between 400 and 500 billion dollars, making him probably the second or third richest human ever to live. Yeah. You got to understand, there's a couple Saudis got bank. You know what I'm saying? They rich. They say one of the Chinese emperors, Mansa Musa, he's the richest on record. And then there's there's a really wealthy family in New York that I don't think that should count, because it takes into account their entire family net worth and then says they're the richest. You know, I think it's the Rothschilds maybe. And but that's like their whole family net worth. But yeah, the Rockefellers are so, and he gave away like half of his wealth too. They're so rich that his family today are still in the top 1% of all wealth in the nation. I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, it really is. It's pretty crazy. And so, yeah, anyway, with all this money and all this labor, that's great. But we only talked about 3 people there that made basically all the money. What about all the people that were working for them? How are they going to turn out? What's happening with them? And that's the last section. We're going to talk about kind of the corruption and the seedy underbelly of industrialization and what really happens there. Okay, and how some of that labor unrest begins. And these are very important topics that we're going to get to.